silk and blood, the soaring melody of an opera aria colliding with the acrid stench of gunpowder. This was the insane finale of a doomed night in Stockholm, 1792. Deep within the glittering chaos of a masquerade ball, where hundreds of nobles hid their secrets behind velvet masks, King Gustav III unwittingly stepped onto the stage for the final performance of his life. Death did not arrive with a scythe. It came dressed in a domino cloak, gliding silently behind the king to whisper a chilling greeting into his ear. "Good evening, beautiful mask," before coldly pulling the trigger. The shot ripped through the air, yet in a twist of cruel irony, the crowd kept dancing in their manic ecstasy, leaving their king to collapse on the floorboards, alone, bloody, and dying amidst the oblivious applause of his own subjects. Gustav was born into the suffocating gray silence of a Stockholm winter, entering the world on January 24th, 1746, not merely as a child, but as an immediate disappointment to the silence that awaited him. He was a fragile creature, born with a caul, a membrane covering the face that old folklore claimed was a sign of greatness or a curse of second sight. Yet his physical presence was underwhelming. He was small, twitchy, and prone to illness, a stark contrast to the martial giants of Swedish legend like Gustavus Adolphus, who had thundered across Europe a century prior. From his very first breath, the infant Gustav was a vessel for the desperate, terrified ambition of a royal house that was slowly dying. He did not belong to himself. He belonged to the ghost of an empire, and more immediately, he belonged to his mother, Louisa Ulrika, a woman whose intellect was as sharp and cold as a Prussian saber. She looked down at the cradle, not with the soft cooing of a parent, but with the appraising eye of a master sculptor looking at a block of raw marble, determining exactly how much chiseling it would take to carve a king out of such soft, yielding flesh. The boy grew up in a palace that felt less like a home and more like a besieged fortress. The wind howling through the drafty corridors of Stockholm Castle carried the whispers of a court paralyzed by paranoia. In the 1740s and 50s, the Swedish monarchy had been stripped of its teeth, reduced to a ceremonial pageant by the Riksdag, a parliament rife with corruption and bought by foreign gold. Gustav's father, King Adolf Fredrik, was a kindly, bovine man who found solace in the simple, repetitive act of making snuff boxes on a lathe, hiding from his responsibilities in the wood shavings. Gustav watched his father with a confusing mixture of affection and profound embarrassment. He saw the King of Sweden scolded by noblemen, overruled by bishops, and treated like a naughty schoolboy by the very subjects he was supposed to rule. Even at the age of 4, Gustav understood the essential tragedy of his existence. His father wore the crown, but he did not hold the scepter. The power lay elsewhere, in the hands of the hats and the caps, political factions that tore the country apart like wolves fighting over a carcass. But it was his mother who dominated the landscape of his mind. Louisa Ulrika was the sister of Frederick the Great, and she carried the Hohenzollern fire in her blood. She despised the Swedish reality. She despised the damp, the darkness, and above all, she despised the mediocrity of her husband. She decided with a terrifying singleness of purpose that her son would be the avenging angel of her dynasty. She isolated him from the corrupting influence of the Swedish stupidity she perceived all around her. The nursery became a classroom, and the classroom became a laboratory. She surrounded the young prince with French philosophers, Italian artists, and German disciplinarians. He was not permitted to be a child, he was required to be a prodigy. She would wake him at dawn to recite the verses of Racine and Voltaire. She scrutinized his posture, his tone, his wit. If he faltered, if he stuttered, the temperature in the room would drop to absolute zero. Her love was a sun that shone brilliantly when he performed well, but vanished instantly behind storm clouds the moment he showed weakness. Gustav learned the most painful lesson of his life before he could even read. Love is not a gift, it is a wage earned through performance. This psychological conditioning created a fracture in the boy's soul that would never heal. To survive the crushing expectations of his mother and the invasive spying of the Parliament, who appointed tutors to report on the prince's every move, Gustav developed a second skin. He learned the art of dissimulation. He discovered that if he smiled a certain way, if he bowed with a specific flourish, if he memorized the correct French aphorism, he could deflect the anger of his mother and the suspicion of his tutors. He became an actor in his own life. The real Gustav, the frightened, sensitive boy who loved to dream, retreated deep inside, building a fortress of imagination where no one could touch him. On the surface, he was the charming, precocious crown prince, dazzling foreign ambassadors with his fluency in languages and his grasp of history. Underneath, he was a lonely observer, watching the adults around him with a cold, clinical detachment, noting their hypocrisies, their greed, and their stupidity. This detachment manifested in a chilling intellectual curiosity. The young Gustav was a child of the Enlightenment, obsessed with reason and science, yet he lacked the innate empathy that usually tempers such pursuits. There is a story, whispered in the margins of court diaries, that illustrates this strange coldness. Fascinated by the medical debates of the time regarding the effects of stimulants, the young prince proposed an experiment using two condemned criminals. He wanted one to drink only tea and the other only coffee every day until one of them died, simply to see which beverage was more toxic. It was a proposal of scientific rigor and utter sociopathy. He viewed the men not as human beings with souls, but as biological components in a grand play he was directing. This was the Vasa fury, taking a new modern form, not the violent rages of his ancestors, but a manic obsessive need to control and categorize the chaotic world around him. The only place where Gustav felt truly alive was the theater. It was not merely a pastime, it was an addiction. In the glow of the stage lights, the chaos of the world was ordered. In a play, the hero always had a speech, the villain always had a motive, and the ending was written before the curtain rose. He began to write his own plays, casting himself in the lead roles. He would spend hours in front of the mirror, practicing expressions, regal anger, benevolent wisdom, tragic sorrow. He was rehearsing for the throne. He realized that kingship in the 18th century was not about divine right. It was about public relations. It was a performance. If his father was a bad actor who forgot his lines, Gustav would be the greatest thespian Europe had ever seen. He studied the way great men walked, the way they held their heads. He treated his daily interactions with the court as scenes. When he walked into a drawing room, he was not entering a room, he was making an entrance. This constant performance was exhausting, draining his nervous energy and leaving him prone to bouts of dark, brooding melancholy. But it was the only armor he had. As he entered adolescence, the pressure intensified. The Parliament, fearing the influence of his domineering mother, tried to separate them. They fired his beloved tutor, Olaf von Dalin, a poet who had fed Gustav's imagination, and replaced him with stern, humorless men loyal to the Constitution. The conflict between the Queen and the Parliament escalated into a Cold War, with Gustav caught in the crossfire. He became a master of doublespeak. He would promise his mother he would destroy the Constitution, and 10 minutes later he would promise his tutors he would uphold it, sounding equally sincere in both instances. This duality began to disturb those close to him. They wondered if there was anything solid at the core of the prince, or if he was simply a series of reflections, mirroring whoever stood in front of him. The rumors began to circulate, whispers about his nature. He was slight. He detested the rough, drunken hunting trips that were the staple of Swedish noble life, and he preferred the company of handsome, artistic men. The court, a pit of toxic masculinity, branded him a fop. They laughed at his French clothes and his obsession with opera. They called him the little Frenchman. They underestimated him completely. They saw the lace and the powder, but they did not see the iron will that had been forged in the fires of his mother's ambition. They did not see that his effeminate interest in the arts was actually a sophisticated understanding of soft power. While the noblemen were drinking themselves into stupors, Gustav was analyzing the political structures of Rome and the military tactics of Caesar. He was sharpening his mind while they dulled theirs. But the greatest test of his acting ability was yet to come. In 1766, the state demanded he secure the succession. A marriage was arranged. The bride was Sophie Magdalene of Denmark. The union was purely political, a treaty sealed with flesh. For Gustav, it was a source of profound dread. He viewed the physical act of intimacy with a woman with a mixture of confusion and revulsion. He had no romantic experience. His passions were intellectual and aesthetic, not carnal. The prospect of marriage was not a joyous milestone, but a terrifying performance for which he had no script. When Sophie Magdalene arrived, she was a shy, pious, serious girl, the exact opposite of the dazzling, witty, theatrical women Gustav admired in literature. There was no spark, only a vast, silent ocean of awkwardness between them. The wedding festivities were grand, a spectacle of gold and light, designed to show the world that the Swedish monarchy was still potent. Gustav played his part to perfection in the public eye. He danced, he bowed, he smiled the smile of a man in love. But as the bedroom door closed on the wedding night, the mask slipped. The silence that descended was heavy and suffocating. The Vasa blood, so volatile and brilliant, seemed to curdle in the face of simple human intimacy. The marriage remained unconsummated, a secret shame that would fester in the heart of the monarchy for years. Gustav had learned to be a king, but he had no idea how to be a husband. As he lay in the darkness of the royal bedchamber, listening to the breathing of a stranger beside him, he felt the crushing weight of the crown more than ever. He was 20 years old. He was the hope of the nation, and he was the loneliest man in Sweden. The overture was finished. The curtain was about to rise on the reign of a king who would turn the entire country into his stage, desperate to drown out the silence of his own soul with the thunderous applause of history. The stagnation of the Swedish court was broken not by a cannon blast, but by a dinner fork. On the night of February 12th, 1771, King Adolf Frederick sat down to a meal that would become the stuff of grotesque legend. It was Shrove Tuesday, a time of indulgence, and the king, a man whose only true kingdom was the dining table, gorged himself with a suicidal enthusiasm. He consumed lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, kippers, and champagne, capping it all off with 14 servings of hetväg, sweet buns served in a bowl of hot milk. Within hours, the king was screaming in agony. His stomach, finally rebelling against the years of passive gluttony, ruptured. He died in the dark, undignified spasms of indigestion. It was a fittingly absurd end for a reign that had been a political farce. But for his son, Gustav, who was thousands of miles away in the glittering salons of Paris, This grotesque tragedy was the signal he had been waiting for all his life. The puppet was dead. The strings were cut. Gustav received the news at the opera in Paris. He was 25 years old, basking in the glow of the French Enlightenment, charming the philosophers, and flirting with the countesses of Versailles. When the courier arrived breathless and muddy, handing him the letter sealed with black wax, Gustav did not weep. He went pale, his large, expressive eyes widening not with grief, but with the sudden, crushing realization of his destiny. He was now Gustav III. He was the king of a country that was effectively bankrupt, politically paralyzed, and teetering on the edge of anarchy. He knew with a chilling clarity that if he returned to Stockholm as the same kind of king his father had been, he would likely die just as vaguely and uselessly. He had to return not as a monarch, but as a revolutionary. He spent his final days in Paris not in mourning, but in a frenzy of secret diplomacy. He met with Louis XV, securing a promise of French gold to pay the Swedish army, knowing that loyalty in Stockholm was a commodity that had to be bought. He met with the cynical old diplomats who warned him that the Caps, the faction currently controlling the Swedish parliament, were effectively agents of Russia. They told him that Catherine the Great was watching him like a wolf watches a limping deer. If he tried to assert his power, she would invade. If he did nothing, she would buy his country piece by piece. Gustav listened, his face a mask of polite concern, while his mind raced with the plot of a drama that would either end in his coronation as an absolute monarch or his execution as a traitor. The return to Sweden was a journey into the heart of winter. As his carriage crossed the frozen Sound and rattled towards Stockholm, the atmosphere shifted from the perfumed elegance of France to the sullen, suspicious gray of the north. The capital that awaited him was a nest of vipers. The Riksdag was already in session, and the Caps were drunk on their own power. They greeted their new king not with reverence, but with studied insolence. At his coronation, they forced him to sign an even more restrictive version of the Constitution, effectively stripping him of the right to appoint his own household staff. They humiliated him publicly, debating his allowance as if he were a wayward teenager. Gustav signed every paper they put in front of him. He smiled. He bowed. He played the part of the submissive, empty-headed dandy to perfection. He wore the mask of the fool so convincing that his enemies relaxed, convinced that the son was just as weak as the father. But beneath the floorboards of the palace, the Vasa fury was simmering. Gustav began to lead a double life. By day, he was the decorative monarch, attending dull Lutheran sermons and nodding politely at the droning speeches of the chaotic parliament. By night, he was a conspirator. He utilized the cover of the Masonic lodges, secret societies where rank was suspended and loyalty was sworn to higher ideals, to build a network of officers who were sick of the parliamentary corruption. He found his key allies in the shadows: Jacob Magnus Springt-Porten, a fiery, reckless soldier from Finland, and Johann Christopher Toll, a brooding tactician. Together they hatched a plot that was breathtaking in its audacity. It was a script for a coup d'etat that read like an adventure novel. The plan was a classic pincer movement, designed to confuse the Russian-backed government. Springt-Porten would incite a rebellion in the fortress of Sveaborg in Finland. Toll would launch a revolt in the southern province of Scania. The government in Stockholm, panicked by these dual uprisings on the periphery, would send the loyal regiments away from the capital to crush the rebels. This would leave Stockholm undefended. At that precise moment, Gustav would drop the mask, seize the arsenal, and arrest the Senate. It was a plan that relied on precise timing, absolute secrecy, and the theatrical manipulation of chaos. But as the summer of 1772 burned on, the script began to fall apart. The caps had spies everywhere. Whispers of a royalist plot began to drift through the coffee houses of Stockholm. The Russian ambassador Osterman smelled a rat and began to pressure the council to arrest the king's friends. The tension in the city was palpable, thick as the humidity rising from the dirty canals. People walked with their heads down. The price of bread was skyrocketing, the people were starving, and the parliament was too busy fighting over bribes to notice. The atmosphere was apocalyptic. Then the timeline shattered. Toll started the rebellion in Scania too early. Sprängporten was delayed by adverse winds in Finland. The government in Stockholm didn't panic and send troops away. Instead, they kept them in the capital and began to investigate the king. On the evening of August 18th, Gustav received a terrified message. The council had uncovered the plot. They were preparing to arrest the ringleaders. Gustav was next. The trap had snapped shut. Gustav spent a sleepless night pacing the floor of his chamber. This was the defining moment of his life. He could flee, he could abdicate, or he could throw the dice. He was alone. His armies were stuck in the provinces. He had no regiments, no money, and the warrant for his arrest was being drafted a few hundred yards away. The biological inheritance of his bloodline, the manic energy, the refusal to accept reality, suddenly crystallized into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He decided to improvise. If he couldn't use force, he would use the only weapon he had left, his voice. The morning of August 19th, 1772, dawned bright and clear. Gustav dressed with meticulous care, choosing a uniform that reminded the soldiers of the glorious days of Charles XII. He hid his fear behind a layer of powder and a dazzling smile. He walked out of the palace and into the guardhouse. The soldiers there were tired, unpaid, and grumpy. They expected a routine inspection. Instead, they got a performance that would change history. Gustav stood before them not as a superior but as a comrade. He began to speak. His voice, usually light and melodic, dropped an octave, resonating with a passionate, trembling intensity. He spoke to them of the starvation in the streets. He spoke of the insults the foreign powers heaped upon the Swedish flag. He spoke of the corrupt politicians who ate French delicacies while the soldiers' children cried for bread. He painted a picture of a nation being sold into slavery. Then, with tears streaming down his face, tears that were perhaps manufactured but effective, he drew his sword. "I will risk my life for you and for the salvation of our fatherland," he cried. "Will you follow me?" For a heartbeat there was silence. The officers looked at each other. This was treason. This was death. But then the sheer magnetic force of Gustav's personality bridged the gap. A young sergeant cheered, then another. Then the room erupted. The soldiers, mesmerized by this prince who finally acted like a king, swore allegiance to him on the spot. In 10 minutes, Gustav had stolen the garrison of Stockholm right from under the nose of the parliament. He didn't stop. Riding a wave of adrenaline, he led the troops through the streets. He tied a white handkerchief around his arm as a sign of recognition, a simple costume choice that became the symbol of the revolution. Supporters poured out of the alleys, tying white rags to their arms. The white revolution had begun. Gustav marched to the council chamber. The senators, deep in debate about how to punish the king, looked up to hear the rhythmic stomping of boots. The doors burst open. They were met not by a warrant, but by bayonets. The men who had bullied Gustav for years, who had insulted his mother and mocked his manhood, shrank back in their velvet chairs. Gustav looked at them with a serene, terrifying calmness. He did not execute them. He did not scream. He simply informed them that their services were no longer required. He locked them in the room. By noon, the city was his. Cannon were placed at the bridges. The fleet was secured. And remarkably, not a single drop of blood had been spilled. It was a masterpiece of stage management. The king rode through the streets, bowing to the cheering crowds, buying rounds of drinks for the sailors, embracing the market women. He was the hero of his own opera. 2 days later, on August 21st, the final act of the coup took place in the Hall of State. The humiliated Parliament was summoned to hear the king. The hall was lined with grenadiers, their muskets loaded, a subtle reminder of the new reality. Gustav ascended the throne, holding the silver scepter. He looked out at the sea of sullen faces. He didn't gloat. Instead, he delivered a speech of scathing brilliance. He lectured them on their greed, their disunity, and their betrayal of the Swedish people. He spoke not as a tyrant, but as a disappointed father. Then he produced a new constitution from his pocket. He read it aloud. It restored the power of the monarchy, reduced the parliament to a consulting body, and swept away 50 years of liberty. He asked them to accept it. The hall was silent. The grenadiers adjusted their grips on their muskets. The parliament voted yes with a single, trembling voice. Gustav III had done the impossible. He had overthrown the government without firing a shot. He had saved Sweden from partition. He was the absolute master of the North. As he walked out of the hall, the applause was deafening. But in the shadows of the gallery, the displaced aristocrats watched him with eyes that burned with a cold, eternal hatred. They did not see a savior. They saw a usurper. They saw an actor who had tricked them. And as they dispersed into the night, nursing their bruised pride, they began to sharpen their knives. The king had won the audience, but he had lost the critics. And in the theater of politics, the critics are the ones who carry guns. The euphoria of the coup would not last. The enlightened despot had taken the stage, but the darkness of the Swedish winter was creeping back in. The adrenaline faded, leaving Gustav alone with the crushing reality of ruling a broken nation. He had the power, but now he had to use it. And every decision he made from this point on would add another name to the list of men who wanted him dead. The curtain fell on Act 1, but the tragedy was only just beginning. The morning after the coup, Sweden woke up with a headache, but it was the headache of a survivor. The anarchy was over. The streets of Stockholm, previously the battleground for rival gangs of political thugs, paid in Russian rubles and British pounds, fell into a strange, orderly silence. Gustav III sat on his recovered throne, the ink still wet on the new constitution, and looked out at a kingdom that was waiting for a miracle. He determined to give them one. The first years of his absolute rule were a dazzling display of what historians call enlightened despotism. It was a contradiction in terms that suited Gustav perfectly. He would use the absolute power of a tyrant to force freedom upon his people. He attacked the medieval darkness of the Swedish legal system with the zeal of a reformer and the flair of a showman. His first target was the dungeon. For centuries, Swedish law had relied on the confession, and the means to extract it were barbaric. Men were broken on the wheel, women were crushed with weights. Gustav, who sickened at the sight of physical cruelty, abolished torture in August 1772, just days after seizing power. It was a decree that shone like a beacon across Europe. While other monarchs were still stretching heretics on racks, Gustav declared that the state had no right to break a man's body to get to his mind. He restricted the death penalty, turning the executioner from a busy civil servant into a lonely figure. He moved on to the soul, in a move that horrified the rigid Lutheran clergy who held a stranglehold on the nation's spiritual life. Gustav pushed for the tolerance edict. He allowed Catholics and Jews, people previously banned from the realm or forced to live in shadows, to practice their faith. It was not done out of pure piety. It was pragmatic. Gustav wanted the Jewish financiers and the Catholic artisans to bring their skills and their capital to Sweden. He wanted a cosmopolitan empire, not a parochial backwater. But the light of the Enlightenment cast long shadows. To fund this modernization, to pay for the new administration, and to maintain the dignity of a court that rivaled Versailles, Gustav spent money he did not have. The national debt began to bloat. He tried to fix the economy with the same theatrical logic he applied to the stage. In 1775, he decided that the crown should control the production of alcohol. He established a royal monopoly on distilling spirits. It was a disaster. The Swedish peasantry, who considered the right to distill their own vodka as God-given liberty, revolted. The Schnapps War was not fought with armies, but with illicit stills hidden in the forests. It was the first crack in the love affair between the king and his people. They loved his style, but they hated his tax collectors. If the economy was failing, Gustav's solution was to change the costumes. He was obsessed with the idea that national unity could be designed. He looked at the Swedish nobility dressed in French silks, speaking French and dreaming of Paris, and he felt a pang of jealous nationalism. He wanted them to look Swedish. In 1778, he launched the nationella dräkten, the national costume. It was a bizarre experiment in social engineering through tailoring. Gustav designed the outfit himself. For men, a black doublet with slashed sleeves reminiscent of the Renaissance era of Gustav Vasa, worn with a cape and a sash. For women, a specific cut of dress that emphasized modesty and grace. He mandated that this costume be worn at court. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of proud, cynical aristocrats forced to dress like extras in a historical period piece, swirling around the ballroom in outfits dictated by the king's whimsy. They smiled and obeyed because Gustav was the absolute monarch. But behind the fans and the masks, the ridicule was savage. They felt like props. The king was turning the entire social hierarchy into a masquerade, blurring the lines between reality and performance until no one knew where the play ended and the government began. But while Gustav was busy dressing the nation, his own house was nakedly dysfunctional. The Vasa fury that plagued his ancestors had skipped his temperament, but perhaps landed in his physiology. The King of Sweden, the father of the nation, was unable to become a father in his own home. His marriage to Sophie Magdalene was a frozen wasteland. For 11 years, the royal bedchamber was a place of humiliation. The queen, shy and deeply religious, retreated into a shell of pious misery. The king, nervous and physically adverse to her, treated her with a polite, icy distance. The lack of an heir was not just a personal sorrow, it was a political crisis. The caps and the disgruntled nobility whispered that the king was impotent, or worse, unnatural. The pressure became unbearable in 1775. The dynasty was at risk of extinction. Gustav needed a solution, and in his desperation he turned to the most Gothic of expedients, a proxy. Enter Count Adolf Fredrik Munk. Munk was a Finnish nobleman, the master of the horse. He was everything Gustav was not, robust, sexually experienced, and earthy. He was a man of the body, not the mind. Gustav, displaying a shocking lack of boundaries that bordered on voyeurism, asked Munk to act as a mediator between him and the queen. The official court records claim Munk's role was merely instructional, that he taught the ignorant royal couple the mechanics of procreation through diagrams and verbal guidance. But the rumors that swirled through the drafty corridors of Drottningholm Palace were far darker. The servants whispered that Munch did more than talk. They whispered that on the nights when the king visited the queen, Munch was present in the room. Some said he stood by the bed. Others said he took the king's place entirely, while Gustav watched from the shadows or waited outside the door, pacing. It is a mystery that will never be solved, but the timing is damning. After 11 years of sterility, shortly after Munch's intervention, the queen announced she was pregnant. The birth of the crown prince, Gustav Adolf, in 1778 should have been a moment of national triumph. Instead, it triggered a family tragedy worthy of a Greek play. The person most suspicious of the miracle birth was the one person who knew Gustav best, his mother, the Queen Dowager Louisa Ulrika. She knew her son's physical aversion to women. She knew of his intense romantic friendships with men. She simply did not believe he was capable of siring a child. Consumed by the bitterness of her own loss of power and a twisted jealousy, Louisa Ulrika did the unthinkable. She spread the rumor that the child was a bastard, the son of Count Munch. She fanned the flames of the scandal, telling her other children that the succession was a fraud. When Gustav heard this, that his own mother was delegitimizing his heir, the bond between them shattered forever. The Vasa fury exploded in him, not as violence, but as a cold, diamond-hard hatred. He forced his mother to sign a formal retraction, a humiliating document where she had to admit she was lying. He paraded the baby in front of the court, challenging anyone to deny the boy's paternity. But the damage was done. The christening was a grim affair. The mother and son stood on opposite sides of the font, their eyes locked in a silent war. Louisa Ulrika, the woman who had forged him, became his greatest enemy. She died a few years later in 1782, alone and embittered, leaving a curse upon the house. On her deathbed, she refused to fully reconcile with Gustav. Her ghost would haunt him. The rumor of the Munch affair never went away. It hung over the young crown prince like a shroud, a constant reminder that the foundations of the Gustavian dynasty were built on secrets, lies, and perhaps the seed of another man. To escape the suffocating atmosphere of his family life, Gustav threw himself deeper into his obsession, the arts. If he could not control the whispers about his bedchamber, he would drown them out with music. He founded the Royal Opera in 1773. He didn't just fund it, he micromanaged it. He wrote librettos. He designed sets. He imported the finest singers from Italy and dancers from France. Stockholm became the Athens of the North. The theater at Gripsholm Castle became the true center of government. During the Christmas of 1776 or the summer festivals of 1779, the court was a non-stop carnival. Plays lasted for days. The king would act in them, taking the roles of heroes and conquerors. It was a psychological release. On stage, he was the virile, decisive warrior he struggled to be in reality. But to the old nobility, the men of iron and earth who remembered the wars of Charles XII, this was grotesque. They saw their king painted and powdered, reciting poetry while the Russian Navy practiced maneuvers in the Baltic. They called him the actor king with a sneer. They saw the vast sums of money flowing into the pockets of singers and set designers, while the army's equipment rusted. A dangerous divide was opening. Gustav was surrounding himself with a new elite, the Gustavians. These were men like Gustav Maurits Armfelt, young, beautiful, witty, and utterly dependent on the king's favor. They were sycophants who shielded Gustav from the harsh realities of the mood in the country. They told him he was loved. They told him he was a genius. They created an echo chamber of praise. Meanwhile, the old aristocratic families, The Fursins, the Brahes, the De Geers were shut out. They retreated to their country estates, brooding. They began to correspond with each other, not about opera, but about tyranny. They saw Gustav's enlightened rule as a mask for a despotism that threatened their ancient privileges. They remembered 1772. They remembered that a king who can give power with a stroke of a pen can also take it away. As the 1780s began, Gustav's disconnect from reality widened. The boundaries of Sweden felt too small for his ambition. He wanted an empire. He looked at the map of the world and decided Sweden needed a tropical colony. In 1784, he concluded a secret deal with France. In exchange for trading rights in Gothenburg, France ceded the tiny, dry, rock-strewn island of San Barthélemy in the Caribbean to Sweden. Gustav was ecstatic. He renamed the harbor Gustavia. He dreamed of gold, sugar, and spice flowing into Stockholm. He even authorized the Swedish West India Company to engage in the slave trade, a horrific moral stain on his enlightened conscience that he conveniently ignored in pursuit of profit. But San Barthélemy was not a gold mine. It was a haven for pirates and smugglers. The profits were meager. The venture was a perfect metaphor for his reign, a grand exotic dream that looked beautiful on a map, but was gritty, morally compromising, and expensive in reality. He even looked further. He had plans drawn up to colonize Australia, specifically Nyasaland. He imagined Swedish cities rising in the antipodes. He was a man trying to play a game of risk with an empty bank account. By 1782, the year of his mother's death, the golden glow of the early reign was fading. The enlightened despot was becoming more despot and less enlightened. The press censorship was tightening again. The Schnapps War had made the peasants angry. The nobility was alienated. The church was suspicious. Gustav stood alone on the stage. The applause was thinning. He could feel the audience getting restless. And like any performer who senses he is losing the crowd, he decided he needed a bigger spectacle, a climax, something loud, dangerous, and glorious to bring them back to their feet. He began to look east, toward Russia, toward the old enemy. He didn't know it yet, but he was writing the script for his own destruction. The Vasa fury was urging him toward a cliff, and the Prussian discipline was meticulously planning the leap. The opera was about to turn into a war movie, and the ending would be written in blood. By 1783, the walls of the Stockholm Palace were closing in. The love affair between the enlightened king and his people had soured. Suffocated by debt and the toxic whispers of the court, Gustav decided to escape. He fled the north for a grand tour of Europe, traveling under the transparent pseudonym of the Count of Haga. It was a desperate psychological retreat. For a year he played the role of a wealthy gentleman of leisure in Italy and France. He walked the ruins of Rome, commissioned statues he couldn't afford, and basked in the fading glitter of Versailles with Marie Antoinette. He refused to see the cracks in the French monarchy. He saw only the glamour. He even purchased the Caribbean island of San Barthélemy in a trade for trading rights, dreaming of a colonial empire. But while the king bought art in Rome, his people were starving in Sweden. He returned in 1784 not as a savior, but as a stranger with empty pockets. The homecoming was a cold shower. The Parliament of 1786 was a disaster. They rejected his reforms and mocked his spending. Gustav, a narcissist who withered without applause, felt betrayed. He realized that peace was destroying his popularity. In peace, people complained about taxes. He needed a distraction. He needed a new, grander production. He decided to attack Russia. It was a delusion of epic proportions. Sweden was a dwarf. Russia under Catherine the Great was a titan. But Gustav wasn't thinking like a general. He was thinking like a playwright. He envisioned a lightning strike on St. Petersburg that would restore Sweden's ancient glory and silence his critics forever. He spent months obsessing over the design of new uniforms, worrying about the color of the sashes while his supply lines rotted. There was a legal problem. The Constitution forbade the king from starting an offensive war. So Gustav staged one. In June 1788, he ordered a tailor at the Royal Opera to sew a set of fake Russian military uniforms. On the Finnish border, Swedish soldiers dressed in these theatrical costumes staged a fake attack on their own outpost at Pumala. It was a false flag operation of the clumsiest sort. Europe laughed and Catherine the Great rolled her eyes, but it gave Gustav his pretext. He declared that the fatherland was under attack. The theater king had finally turned the battlefield into a stage. The war was a catastrophe from the opening curtain. The Swedish Navy failed to crush the Russian fleet at the Battle of Hagelin, ending the dream of a quick capture of St. Petersburg. The war bogged down into a grueling stalemate in the mosquito-infested forests of Finland. The soldiers starved, the diseases spread, and then the nobility struck back. The aristocratic officers of the army, who hated Gustav and knew the war was a fraud, committed the ultimate betrayal. At the Angela Manor House, 113 officers signed a letter of mutiny. They declared the war illegal and sent a secret message to Catherine the Great, proposing peace behind the king's back. Gustav was trapped in his tent in the Finnish mud. The Russians were in front of him, and his own generals were sharpening their knives behind him. The Vasa fury gave way to a suicidal depression. The king sat alone, a broken figure in a splendid uniform, waiting to be dragged back to Stockholm in chains. The drama had turned into a tragedy, and it seemed the final act had arrived. In the winter of 1789, Gustav III returned to Stockholm, not as a failure, but as a populist avenger. He summoned a hostile Riksdag, determined to break the spine of the aristocracy. When the noblemen refused to fund his war, Gustav turned to the lower estates, the peasants and burghers. He dined with farmers and spoke their dialect, painting the nobility as traitors to the nation. On February 17th, he marched into the hall of the nobility and shouted down the leading aristocrats. It was a coup from the throne. He forced through the Act of Union and Security, a document that gave him absolute power and stripped the nobility of their ancient privileges. To the people, it was liberation. To the nobles, it was a slave act. By arresting opposition leaders like Count Fersen, Gustav won supreme power, but he created a class of men who had stopped arguing and started plotting murder. With his power secured at home, Gustav returned to the front lines, desperate for a military triumph to seal his authority. In June 1790, his obsession with capturing St. Petersburg led him into a trap. He sailed his massive archipelago fleet deep into Viborg Bay, only to be blockaded by the Russian Navy. For a month, the King of Sweden was trapped in a bottle, his men dying of scurvy and thirst under the summer sun. On July 3rd, he ordered a desperate breakout, the Viborg Gauntlet. It was a scene from hell. The Swedish fleet had to sail single file through a corridor of Russian fire. Ships exploded, men drowned in droves, and Gustav barely escaped with his life on his royal galley. It looked like the end. The shattered remnants of the fleet limped into the defensive maze of Svensksund. His officers begged him to flee, but Gustav refused. In a moment of cold, desperate clarity, he ordered the fleet to turn and fight. On July 9, 1790, The Russian navy, arrogant and hungry for the kill, sailed straight into Gustav's ambush. The Swedes, anchored in a crescent formation, unleashed a wall of fire. The Russians were trapped in the narrow channels, blinded by their own smoke. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. 50 Russian ships were lost. 9,000 men were killed or captured. It was the greatest naval victory in the history of the Baltic Sea. The theater king had just delivered a masterclass in destruction. The victory saved Sweden's independence. Catherine the Great agreed to the Peace of Verdi in August 1790. Gustav returned to Stockholm as a hero, building pavilions to house captured Russian flags. But the applause was hollow. The war had bankrupted the state, and the Act of Union and Security had radicalized his enemies. The nobility did not cheer for the victory at Svensksund. They sat in their dark libraries reading Roman history, realizing that political opposition was no longer enough. The war had turned them from politicians into fanatics. Gustav thought the drama was a heroic epic. He didn't realize it had become a revenge tragedy. The scripts were done, the pistols were being loaded, the peace with Russia had silenced the cannons, but it had not silenced the ghosts. Stockholm in 1791 was a city suffering from a hangover, a headache of debt, inflation, and exhausted glory. The victory at Svensksund had been a brilliant flash of lightning, but it left the landscape darker than before. The treasury was empty, the people were hungry, the hospitals were full of maimed veterans begging for bread. Yet Gustav III, the eternal dreamer, refused to look at the grime. His eyes were fixed on a new, even grander stage, France. The French Revolution had exploded, sending shockwaves of terror through the veins of every monarch in Europe. But while other kings watched with paralyzed fear, Gustav watched with a strange romantic excitement. He saw himself as the knight of the Ancien Regime. He, the Democrat king, who had stripped his own nobility of power, paradoxically decided that he was the only man capable of saving Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette from the mob. He began to draft plans that were delusional in their grandeur. He imagined a coalition of European powers, Russia, Austria, Spain, united under his command. He saw himself landing in Normandy at the head of a Swedish-Russian armada, marching on Paris, dispersing the Jacobin rabble, and restoring the Bourbon throne. He spent hours designing the uniforms for this crusade. He wrote passionate, chivalric letters to the imprisoned French royal family, promising salvation. He was Don Quixote, tilting at the windmills of history, oblivious to the fact that his own house was burning down behind him. This obsession with France was the final insult to his enemies at home. The Swedish nobility watched in horror as their king planned to spend the last pennies of the bankrupt state on a foreign adventure. They saw a madman who would sacrifice Sweden's sons to play the hero in a French drama. The time for political opposition was over. The time for removal had arrived. In the shadowed drawing rooms of Stockholm's elite, the conversation shifted from grievances to ballistics. A conspiracy began to coalesce, not around a single leader, but like a hydra with many heads, united only by a common hatred. At the center of the web sat General Carl Frederick Peklin. He was 72 years old, a relic of the Age of Liberty. They called him the Spider. He did not carry a weapon. He carried secrets. Peklin was a master manipulator, a man who had spent 50 years buying and selling politicians. He had no ideology other than power. He saw Gustav not as a king, but as a usurper who had stolen the game board. Peklin provided the venue, the wine, and the cold, cynical logic for the murder. He was the producer of the tragedy. Then there were the young wolves, Count Adolf Ribbing and Count Klaus Frederick Horn. They were the tragic heroes of the plot, young, handsome, intelligent, and eaten alive by bitterness. Ribbing had been a favorite of the king, a dazzling courtier, until a personal slight, a marriage blocked by Gustav, a title refused, turned his love into a black obsidian hate. He wandered the streets of Stockholm like a fallen angel, burning with a romantic desire for tyrannicide. He saw himself as Brutus, the noble Roman striking down Caesar to save the Republic. And then there was the instrument, the executioner, Jacob Johann Ankarström. He was not a courtier. He was not a politician. He was a creature of the shadows. A former military officer of minor nobility, he had retired to his country estate to brood. Ankarström was a man of frightening intensity. He was a religious fanatic, a dark Old Testament Lutheran who believed in a God of wrath and judgment. He believed that Gustav III was not just a bad king, but the Antichrist, a man who broke his oaths, who led the nation into sin, who mocked God's laws with his frivolous theaters and his sodomite friends. Ankarström had personal grievances, too. He had been accused of sedition during the war, humiliated by the king's spies, and financially ruined by the king's economic policies. But his motivation transcended money. He viewed the assassination not as a crime, but as a judicial execution commanded by heaven. He walked through the winter of 1792 with the eerie calm of a man who has already died. He practiced his marksmanship daily. He loaded his pistols with a specific cruel mixture, lead bullets and rusty nails. He wanted the king to suffer. He wanted the wound to fester, just as the king's reign had festered in the soul of the nation. The conspirators were not professional killers. They were amateurs, fueled by adrenaline and wine. They botched several attempts in the early months of 1792, scenes that play out like a black comedy of errors. In January, the king summoned a diet in the town of Gävle. The location was a fortress surrounded by loyal regiments. Gustav, perhaps sensing the danger in Stockholm, moved the government to this frozen outpost. The conspirators followed him. They planned to kidnap him, to shoot him in his sleigh, to blow up the stove in his bedroom. But the king was elusive. He moved fast, surrounded by guards, always changing his schedule. The Spider Peklin stayed in Stockholm, sending frustrated letters. The young wolves, Horn and Ribbing, lost their nerve in the biting cold. Ankarström stalked the perimeter, shivering, his hand on his pistol, waiting for a clear shot that never came. They tried again at Haga Palace, the king's beloved retreat just outside the capital. It was a snowy, silent landscape. Gustav often walked alone in the park, lost in his dreams of French crusades. Ankarström hid behind the trees, watching the small, slight figure of the monarch trudging through the drifts. He raised his pistol, but the snow crunched. A guard turned. The moment passed. These failures only heightened the tension. The conspirators knew they were running out of time. The secret police were sniffing around. The circle was closing. They needed a public venue, a place where the king would be distracted, exposed, and unable to escape. They chose the Royal Opera House. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. The place Gustav had built to glorify himself, the temple of his art, the stage where he felt most alive, was chosen as his slaughterhouse. A masquerade ball was scheduled for Friday, March 16, 1792. It was the perfect setting. A masquerade is a world of anonymity. Everyone wears a mask. Rank is hidden. Servants can dance with countesses. Assassins can walk next to kings. The confusion, the music, the crushing crowds, it provided the perfect cover for the strike and the escape. On the afternoon of March 16th, the conspirators met for a final Last Supper at Peklin's farm. The mood was electric, hysterical. They drank heavily. They toasted to liberty. They cast lots to see who would fire the shot, a ritual to bind them all in blood guilt. But it was a formality. Ankerstrom had always claimed the right. He showed them his pistols. He was calm, almost beatific. Back at the palace, the atmosphere was heavy with omens. Gustav was exhausted. He had spent the day working on plans for the French invasion. He was warned. His spies told him there were whispers of a plot. His friends begged him to cancel the ball. But Gustav III was a fatalist. He believed in destiny. He believed that a king could not hide from his fate. To stay in his room would be an admission of fear, and fear was the one thing the Vasa blood could not tolerate. He looked at his favorite, Count Essen, and smiled a thin, weary smile. "If I listened to every warning," he said, "I would never leave my bed. Besides, who would dare to kill me in my own opera?" As the evening deepened, the snow began to fall over Stockholm, burying the city in a shroud of white. The opera house glowed like a lantern in the dark, its windows blazing with candlelight, the sound of the orchestra spilling out into the frozen streets. Inside, the scene was phantasmagoric. Hundreds of guests dressed in silks and satins, their faces hidden behind masks of velvet and papier-mâché, swirled to the music. Harlequins, shepherdesses, dominoes, and ghosts danced the contradance. It was a sea of shifting identities. Gustav dined in his private apartments above the stage. He was in high spirits, manic, talking rapidly about the future. During the meal, a page entered with a letter. It was anonymous. The letter was written in French, the language of the court, but the hand was shaky. It was a final, desperate warning. It detailed the plot. It begged the king not to go down to the ballroom. "Do not go down. They are waiting for you. This is not a rumor. This is death." Gustav read it. He handed it to Count Essen. Essen went pale. "Sire," he whispered, "you must not go." Gustav stood up. He walked to the window and looked down at the ballroom floor below. He saw the masks, the colors, the life. He felt the pull of the audience. He was the lead actor. The show could not go on without him. "They want to frighten me," he said, his voice hard. "They want to show Europe that the King of Sweden is a coward who hides in his room. I will not give them that satisfaction." He put on his costume. It was understated, almost somber. A gray silk domino cloak, a black tricorn hat with white plumes, and on his chest the glittering star of the Order of the Seraphim, a target of silver and diamonds. He picked up his mask. It was a simple black half mask, the kind that hides the eyes but reveals the mouth that was known for its charm, its wit, and its lies. He tied the strings. He looked in the mirror one last time. The face of the man disappeared and only the king remained. "Let us go," he said. "Let us see if they dare." He opened the doors and stepped out into the corridor. The music swelled up to meet him, a joyful, triumphant melody that masked the sound of the ticking clock. He walked towards the stairs, toward the light, toward the man with the rusty nails in his pocket, who was waiting in the shadows of the wings. The stage was set. The players were in position. The final act had begun. The clock struck midnight. The Royal Opera House was vibrating. The floorboards, usually reserved for the delicate footsteps of ballet dancers, now groaned under the weight of hundreds of revelers. The air was a suffocating cocktail of expensive French perfume, the tallow of burning wax candles, and the sweat of a nervous aristocracy. To the casual observer, it was a carnival of joy. To the handful of men waiting in the crowd with knives hidden under their cloaks, it was a hunting ground. Gustav III stepped into this cauldron of noise with the practiced ease of a man who owned the room. He was leaning on the arm of Count Essen, moving with a slight limp, an affectation, or perhaps the physical manifestation of his weariness. He did not stay in the safety of the royal box. He descended into the crush. He wanted to be among his people, or perhaps he wanted to tempt the fates one last time. He moved towards the foyer, a narrow passage where the crowd was thickest. As he walked, a group of men in black domino cloaks and white masks began to move. They did not approach him directly. They drifted like debris caught in a current, slowly cutting off his escape routes. They formed a box around the king. It was a military formation disguised as a dance. Gustav stopped to speak to someone. In that split second of stillness, the trap snapped shut. The conspirators pressed in. The heat of their bodies was oppressive. One of them, likely Count Horn, tapped the king on the shoulder, a mock-friendly gesture to distract him. Gustav turned. Behind him, Jakob Johann Ankarström stepped forward. He did not hesitate. He did not tremble. He raised the pistol, a heavy, brutal weapon loaded with its payload of rusty nails and lead scraps, and pressed the muzzle against the gray silk of the king's domino, just above the left hip, angled upwards towards the intestines. He whispered the trigger phrase, a grotesque perversion of courtly etiquette. Bonjour, beau masque. He pulled the trigger. The sound was not a thunderclap. In the acoustic chaos of the opera house, muffled by the thick fabric of the cloaks and the drone of the music, the shot sounded flat and dull, like a heavy book dropped on a carpet. But the impact was catastrophic. The explosion tore through the silk, through the flesh, and shattered the king's pelvis. The rusty iron shrapnel shredded his internal organs. Gustav buckled. He did not fall immediately. The press of the crowd held him upright for a horrific second, but his face went ashen behind his mask. He cried out in French, the language of his soul, "Ah, je suis blessé." Countess caught him as he collapsed. The king, gripping Essen's arm with a strength born of shock, whispered urgently, "Take me away. Someone has shot me." For a moment, the music played on. The dancers nearby, thinking the pop was a firecracker or a prank, laughed. But then the smell hit them. The acrid, sulphurous stench of gunpowder mixed with the metallic tang of blood began to drift through the perfume. The conspirators, realizing the king was not dead, panicked. They began to shout, "Fire! Fire!" hoping to trigger a stampede that would allow them to escape in the confusion. The crowd surged. Screams replaced the violins. The masquerade dissolved into a nightmare of trampled skirts and dropped masks. But Gustav, bleeding to death on the floor, was still the director of the scene. Even in agony, his mind was razor-sharp. He saw the plan. He gasped an order to the captain of the guard, "Close the doors. Let no one leave." The iron gates of the opera house slammed shut. The trap designed for the king had become a cage for his assassins. The police chief, Lilienspara, arrived with a terrifying speed. He was a man who had anticipated this night for years. He ordered the music to stop. The sudden silence was heavier than the noise. The guests were lined up against the walls, shivering in their finery. One by one, they were forced to remove their masks. It was a scene of surreal Gothic horror. The glittering elite of Sweden, stripped of their anonymity, staring into the faces of the police. The floor was slick with the king's blood. In the corner, someone found the murder weapon, a discarded pistol and a knife, dropped by Ankarström in his panic. The king was carried back to his apartments on a makeshift stretcher. He was in excruciating pain, but he remained strangely calm. He looked at the chaos he was leaving behind, the crying courtiers, the sullen conspirators, and reportedly said with a flash of his old wit, "It seems I have been carried out in a procession, just like the Pope." He did not die that night. The tragedy of Gustav III was that he was denied a quick exit. He was condemned to the slow, grinding torture of the 18th century sickroom. For 13 days, The king lay in his bed at the Stockholm Palace. The medical science of the time was a horror show. The surgeons, lacking anesthesia or antiseptics, probed the wound with unwashed fingers and metal instruments, trying to fish out the rusty nails and lead shot deep in his pelvis. Each examination was a new assassination. Infection set in almost immediately. Gangrene began to eat the king alive. The smell in the royal chamber became unbearable, yet as his body rotted, his spirit seemed to purify. The actor king, who had spent his life accused of being shallow and vain, showed a stoic courage that humbled his enemies. He did not scream. He did not beg. He continued to rule. He appointed a regency council for his son. He dictated letters. Most shockingly, he forgave. When he learned that Ankarström had been arrested, identified the next morning by the gunsmith who had repaired the pistols, Gustav forbade any torture. He refused to hear the names of the other conspirators. He wanted to die as a Christian monarch, not a vengeful tyrant. "Let them live," he whispered. "I want no more blood." He spent his final hours playing cards with his friends, listening to the news from France, and comforting his weeping family. He reconciled with his brother, Duke Charles. He spoke to his son, the young Gustav IV Adolf, passing the poisoned chalice of the Vasa legacy to a boy who was too young to hold it. On the morning of March 29th, 1792, the pain finally stopped. The infection had reached his heart. Gustav looked at his valet and whispered his final line, a simple, unscripted admission of fatigue. "I feel sleepy. A few moments' rest would do me good." He closed his eyes. The king of the opera was dead. The king's mercy did not extend to the courts. The public demanded blood. The investigation was swift and brutal. Ankarström, the instrument of God, was broken. His punishment was medieval, a piece of theater designed to terrify. He was not just executed, he was dismantled. For 3 consecutive days he was flogged in the public squares of Stockholm. He stood in the pillory, the iron collar around his neck, while the mob jeered and threw filth at him. He bore it with a stony, fanatical silence, never asking for mercy, convinced he was a martyr. On April 27, 1792, he was taken to the scaffold. His right hand, the hand that pulled the trigger, was chopped off. Then his head was struck from his shoulders with an axe. His body was quartered and displayed on wheels at the city gates, food for the crows. The other conspirators, General Pechlin, Counts Horn, and Ribbing, were spared the axe but suffered a fate that for men of their rank was perhaps worse: civil death. They were stripped of their titles, their lands, and their names. They were exiled, doomed to wander Europe as ghosts, stateless and despised. Count Ribbing ended his days in Paris, living in poverty, telling stories of the murder to anyone who would buy him a drink, a living relic of a regicide. The assassination of Gustav III marked the definitive end of the Swedish Empire's imperial ambitions and the Vasa dynasty. While his incompetent son eventually lost the crown to the French Bernadotte line, which rules Sweden to this day, Gustav's true legacy endures not in politics, but in the cultural soul of the nation. By founding the Swedish Academy and the Royal Opera, he transformed a peripheral nation into a beacon of artistic beauty. His life was a performance, and his death at a masked ball became a timeless myth, eventually immortalized by Verdi's Un ballo in Maschera. Though the original opera house where he was shot was demolished, the echo of his influence remains. Gustav III lived as if the world were a stage, orchestrating his own exit as the 18th century's most dramatic curtain call, forever remaining the tragic phantom of his own opera.